Before I dig in, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the work and life of Dr. Richard Redding. Richard Redding performed all of the initial faunal identification of what came to total nearly 18,000 bones from the assemblage at Kedesh. Without his work over the many years and seasons of excavation, I would have not been able to perform any of the analysis and the interpretations that you will see here today. I hope that my presentation of this data and interpretation of this material honors his memory and his legacy in the field of zooarchaeology. This lecture focuses on the site of Kedesh and its relationship and interactions within the surrounding region. A major point of this discussion will be centered on Kedesh's role as an administrative site and tax collection center in the Persian and Hellenistic periods, and how this site's residents interacted with the Phoenician city-state of Tyre. Before I delve into the animal remains recovered from the site, I want to take a bit of time to briefly discuss the history of the excavations at Kedesh and our understanding of the history and archaeology of Galilee during the Persian and Hellenistic periods. So as that map very clearly showed, Kedesh lies near the modern-day border of Israel and Lebanon. And there goes the heating. So there's our lovely site of Kedesh there, and over yonder is Lebanon. Initial survey and excavation of the site began in the late 1990s. For those of you who know her, that is Andrea Berlin right there. Actually, I'm realizing this picture is probably as old as I am, which is a scary thought, but there we go. During this initial excavation, site excavators recovered remains and pottery that dated to the 2nd century BCE, firmly situating the site in the Hellenistic period. After magnetometry, Sharon Herbert and Andrea Berlin quickly realized the scale of the building. The building itself is around 1,924 meters squared. I think it comes out to about 30,000 square feet. And this monumental construction was purposely situated on the edge of the tell so that it was visible for those approaching from the south and the east. Excavations quickly uncovered storerooms, one of which you can see here, that were abruptly abandoned in the middle of the 2nd century BCE with vessels left in situ. These vessels were largely restorable, and phytolith analysis revealed that they largely held a type of wheat that excavators have identified as likely being the Syrian wheat mentioned in papyrological sources. For those who are staring at this slide being, what the heck is Triticum aestivum? It's bread wheat. If you buy flour today, 10 times out of 10, it's going to be from a varietal of Triticum aestivum. So the vast scale of this building and these storage vessels made clear that Kedesh served as both an administrative center and as a tax collection and storage depot. This led Sharon Herbert and Andrea Berlin to refer to the building as the Persian-Hellenistic Administrative Building, which I'll abbreviate throughout this talk as the PHAB, because it's a very fabulous building. Sorry, fun joke. Now, you may be wondering, why were all of these 2nd century BCE vessels left in situ, and why was this monumental facility abandoned in such haste? Well, the text potentially provides a hint as to why Kedesh was abandoned, though this is something we'll complicate and come back to later. The main thing to take away here is that Kedesh is mentioned in the first book of Maccabees in relation to a potential military campaign by Jonathan. The text makes reference to Kedesh as a kind of signpost for the battle, as while we have evidence of abandonment at the site, we have zero evidence of Jonathan or Hasmonean soldiers razing or destroying the building in any way. The main thing to note is that this event, as described in the text, has been dated to around 143 BCE, which aligns very neatly with the final dates that we have for stamped Rhodian amphora handles that were recovered from inside of the building, which those date to about 144 to 143 BCE. So we briefly now referenced the end of imperial occupation in the building, but we need to talk about how it all started. At the start of the 5th century BCE, Phoenicians from the coast came to the tell and found it empty with a smattering of earlier Iron Age ruins. Here they chose to construct this monumental building. In its initial construction in the Persian period, the PHAB served several purposes. It was a place of residence for seemingly elite Phoenicians from the coast, a space for hosting events and feasts, and a supply depot for storing agricultural commodities and tax in kind collected from surrounding communities before sending these goods back to the coast. Now, during this time, Kedesh was nominally under the control of the Persian Empire. However, we can generally think of Kedesh and Upper Galilee as a whole as, I would say, not really being a main focus for those ruling from Persepolis. Rather, the archaeology shows that Upper Galilee was very firmly under the hegemony of Tyre. So how do we see this in the archaeological record? Well, the ceramic data here is a really good key and very neatly shows this relationship between the interior and the coast. For instance, the site of Mitzpe Yamin, which was a shrine to the goddess Astarte, the vessels here show this sort of pilgrimage and movement of people from Tyre to Mitzpe Yamin and back. We also have other sites in Upper Galilee with material culture and architecture that firmly place them as Phoenician in character. And the ceramic material from Kedesh further really emphasizes this point, showing the movement of goods and vessels between Kedesh and Tyre. And so these sites and assemblages provide a general picture of how rule functioned in this place, illustrating that Upper Galilee in the Persian period was largely Phoenician in character and was generally part of the Kora or zone of influence of Tyre, that being up until around 332 BCE. What happens? This guy enters the scene. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. Many of you likely know this mosaic. This guy here is Alexander the Great. Now, at around 332 BCE, Alexander the Great set out to conquer most of the known world, and I think too honestly, kind of the shock and surprise of everyone at the time, successfully did it. Now, after this astounding success, he unfortunately did not have the foresight to avoid his untimely demise. In the aftermath of his death and with no clear successor, his empire was divided between his generals. After several decades of war between these generals, things generally settled into the map that we have here at the turn of the 3rd century BCE. The two empires of concern to us today are the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid. We can see that the southern Levant, including Kedesh, fell under the rule of Ptolemy I. This was rather frustrating to his former peer and now rival Seleucus I, who in one of these wars between these generals was promised the region of the southern Levant. And this really set the stage for over a century of warfare between these two empires over who would effectively rule the region. Now, this is kind of a throwback to what Upper Galilee looks like during the Persian period. How does this change circa 300 BCE? Well, Ptolemy really sets out to clearly claim this region as part of his territory and feels the need to justify his rule. So how do we see him doing this? Well, first, he establishes a border shrine specifically to Pan-Apanaeon. Many of you likely know it as Banias, and this marks the furthest extent of his territory. At the same time, we see the founding of Ptolemais, today Akko. And then in terms of these formerly Tyrian sites, what happens to them? So the shrine at Mitzpe Yamin is abandoned, and we see the establishment of a new shrine much closer to Tyre proper. And the final nail in the coffin here is really what happens to Kedesh itself. At the approach of Alexander's armies, Kedesh is abandoned. Conceivably, people are fleeing to take shelter behind the walls at Tyre. And so for about 30 some years, the building is sitting empty, it's dilapidated, not really a fun place to be, but Ptolemaic officials effectively appropriate it and turn it into their seat of power in the region. So by the start of the 3rd century BCE, we thus see a dramatic truncation in Tyrian authority and the establishment of Ptolemaic control in Upper Galilee. So what does this look like in the FAB itself? Well, Ptolemaic modifications to the FAB were rather extensive and largely focused on expanding the tax collection and storage capabilities of the building. We can see the construction of various storerooms throughout the building, as well as these bin rooms that held plastered bins that people could pour agricultural goods and commodities into. At the same time, we see the conversion of formerly open court spaces into a collection of smaller and smaller rooms. So while we have the preservation of reception and residential spaces in the Ptolemaic FAB, the emphasis under these new residents really seems to have largely focused on tax collection and storing agricultural surplus. Now, this lasts for about a century, and then we have yet another strong man enter the scene, this time Antiochus III. And as I kind of mentioned Matt Grudd, he sets out to finally conquer the southern Levant for his dynasty. Now, he has a failed attempt a few years earlier, but by around 200 to 195 BCE, in what is known as the Fourth Syrian War, the southern Levant and the province of Coele-Syria effectively is incorporated into the Seleucid Empire. Despite this changeover in rule, the first decades of Seleucid administration are marked by very minimal changes in the FAB. If anything, it seems that Antiochus wanted to absorb the province into his empire as quickly as possible, and to do so, he simply left previous Ptolemaic officials in place. Based on the lack of change to Kedesh itself in these initial years of Seleucid administration, we can conclude that those in residence and officials in charge of the building likely remain the same. We do, however, see change starting in the 160s BCE. Administrators at Kedesh remodeled parts of the building, and so one example of this, if you look at the southern part of this plan, is the installation of a drainage channel. In contrast to the Ptolemaic phase, which largely focused on expanding the tax collecting capabilities of the FAB, Seleucid officials seem to have taken a greater focus on hosting and reception spaces. And so one place that we can see this is in the Northeast reception room. I like to think that they kind of gave the building a little bit of a facelift, at least in certain places. And we can see this through things like these preserved fragments of painted stucco that would have been decorating the walls. I'll be honest with you, these are certainly lavish, but in the reconstructions, they're a little garish, but they're still lavish nonetheless. At the same time, the FAB takes on a new role. This phase sees the establishment of the archive complex at Kedesh. From this complex, excavators recovered thousands of clay ceilings that have impressions from individual signet rings. These ceilings would have been used to enclose documents that were then stored in the archive. Based on the analysis of these ceilings, Sharon Herbert suggests that the archive at Kedesh was neither royal nor private in character, but instead seems to have been open to people in surrounding communities. So unfortunately, the lavish Seleucid FAB was not meant to last. After only some 2 decades, the FAB was abandoned in abrupt haste. If we refer to this passage from the first book of Maccabees, it is easy to point the blame at Jonathan for the abandonment of the FAB. However, Kedesh is not the only site abandoned in this moment in the 140s BCE. Now, this is certainly not a comprehensive list. This is a figure that I'm still working on, but the general pattern we see is that sites are abandoned with little to no evidence of destruction at the sites themselves in terms of site architecture. If we solely rely on the first book of Maccabees and postulate the idea of a Hasmonean military campaign in Galilee, it is easy to point the finger at Jonathan for this moment of widespread depopulation and abandonment. However, the Maccabees do not exist in a vacuum, and they were certainly not the only players on the scene. At this same exact moment, the Seleucid Empire was in turmoil. Without going into great detail, 143 BCE saw 2 competing claims to the Seleucid throne between Tryphon and Demetrius. Cities took different sides, and we can see this in which coins they chose to mint. What this means is that effectively the Southern Levant was a power vacuum. There are different players involved, there are different people who are competing for territory and control. While it is certainly possible that the Hasmoneans did cause the rapid abandonment at Kedesh, and in fact, in the case of Kedesh, I do think they are the likely culprit, it is also undoubtedly true that many of these sites throughout Galilee that were abandoned also could have done so because of fighting related to the Seleucid throne wars. Now, regardless of who is causing it, Kedesh is abandoned. I'm going to put a pin in this for the moment and come back to it later, as the abandonment at Kedesh is somewhat complicated and features people returning and actively decommissioning and destroying the archive. Now, in the aftermath of this abandonment, the function of the FAB changes. Rather than serving as a place to host administrators, the FAB sees new occupation that appears to be rather sporadic and seasonal. Based on coins and other material finds, Herbert and Berlin suggests that these squatters, quote unquote, were likely traveling garrisons of soldiers in the employ of various competing Ptolemaic and Seleucid kings and queens. They installed taboons throughout the building and appear to have used it as a sort of kitchen, mess hall, and supply depot. These soldiers likely didn't camp inside the remains of the building, but instead camped in tents on the tell. Now, you may be wondering, what the heck does any of this have to do with the fauna? The historical reality of the FAB and the empires that loomed overhead directly shape the questions that we can ask using the animal remains recovered from inside of the building. As an administrative and tax collection center that was ruled by 3 different empires over several centuries, It is important to acknowledge and understand changes in systems of rule and changes in the region itself in order to understand how they may have or may not have affected things like herding, animal management, economy, and provisioning practices in the area surrounding Kedesh. So with this stage set, we can now begin to think about questions in regards to the fauna. Did these shifting borders and empires have actual tangible effects on animal economy and the local environment? Do we see differences in how, my internet connection is unstable, okay. Do we see differences in how different residents of the building were provisioned over time? So for instance, what state are animals arriving into the building, and does this change for different residents? So do we have evidence of particular cuts of meat being brought into the building? Oh, front row. One second, pause, share. Are we good? Okay, sorry for the brief interruption, folks. All right, so what state are animals arriving in? Do we see evidence of particular cuts of meat being brought into the building, or do we have evidence of animals being brought up the tell and then butchered on the mound? And then finally, are imperial administrators, can I close this? Okay, there we go. Are imperial administrators changing or influencing animal management, or are they simply kind of molding onto these existing working frameworks and systems of animal economy and management? Okay. I want to take a moment to also emphasize the scale of this material and how it differs from currently published assemblages. This figure represents published assemblages from neighboring sites, with the y-axis showing the number of bone fragments recovered in each assemblage. So for those who don't speak zooarchaeologist, NISP is an abbreviation for the number of identified specimens, which is just a very fancy way of saying how many bone fragments were counted in this assemblage. So now, to be fair, the timescale for these assemblages all differs. Tel Istaba is only reflecting Seleucid occupation, and for Tel Anafa, I'm only including the counts for the Hellenistic phases. However, the NISP for sites like Tel Dorr are capturing material from as early as the Iron Age to the Roman period. Thus, even though Kedesh is capturing material only from circa 500 BCE up until the 120s BCE, the amount of recovered fauna is exceptional. The wealth of animal bones seems to really largely be the result of excavators' conscious use of 4mm mesh screen throughout the excavation process, which allowed for fragmentary and small remains to be recovered in quantities that they would not have been otherwise. However, with this recovery of so much fragmentary material, we also then need to problematize and think about taphonomy and how the life history of the building affected our preserved assemblage. So with this chronicled history of repeated and robust remodeling in the building, so thinking back to all those various phase plans I showed and how the building is changing and evolving, it's important to acknowledge and understand how this may have affected our faunal assemblage. We know that floors were leveled, and to do so, builders gathered nearby fill, including animal bones, to serve as the material they used to level out these floors. This means that basically all of the fauna recovered in the FAB, while clearly associated with occupants' consumption, is coming from tertiary deposits. This thus limits our ability to reconstruct any sort of spatial patterning in terms of the distribution of fauna in the building, and I think it also raises very meaningful questions about taphonomy and potential biases in the representation of taxa or certain bone elements in the assemblage, and this is something that I'll tackle in, I think, about 2 slides. All right, finally, general overview of our fauna. So looking at our first 5 phases, we have 33 loci with fauna dating to the Achaemenid or simply the Persian period, 32 from the Ptolemaic, 73 from the Seleucid, only 7 from the abandonment, and 30 from the squatter phase. Across these phases, the NISP for mammals is approximately 6,500 in the Persian, around 3,300 in the Ptolemaic, approximately 3,700 in the Seleucid, 940 in the abandonment, and around 3,400 in the squatter. When comparing this to the non-mammal taxa, it's clear that mammals vastly outnumber them. So really, the majority of what people are eating and consuming at Kedesh are mammals. Non-mammals are really more kind of an infrequent or rare occurrence in terms of consumption. All right. So when examining the general breakdown of the mammal remains at Kedesh, it is surprising how extremely similar these pie charts appear across all phases and despite varying total NISPs for these phases. Mammals identified to the genus or species level generally represent 13 to 17% of the mammal assemblage across phases. Medium mammals dominate all phases at 64 to 68% of recovered remains and likely represent unidentified and fragmentary remains of sheep goats. Large mammals represent approximately 4 to 9% of identified remains. Small mammals are almost entirely non-existent, and unidentified mammal remains, those that were not able to be grouped to a size category, compose the remaining 9 to 13%. What's noteworthy is the consistency in the relative percentages of each of these identified categories across phases. This indicates that whatever taphonomic processes were occurring in the building, from deposition to redeposition to being broken up by remodeling or robbing activities, seem to have been rather uniform across phases. And so really, if you take anything away from this slide, the key takeaway is that it doesn't seem that any one phase is more fragmentary than another, or that one phase is seemingly better preserved and had more fauna that was able to be identified to the genus or species level. And so this pattern produces then some degree of confidence in directly comparing the relative abundance of taxa across phases, as all of these phases seem to be taphonomically biased or altered in a somewhat similar manner. All right, finally getting into what animals were actually identified. So we can see with the mammal assemblage across phases that it is dominated by livestock such as cow, sheep, goat, and pig. Notably, the proportion of pig increases in the Hellenistic phases, reaching its peak in the Seleucid era. This is a rather expected phenomenon and documented at other sites during this transition from the Persian to Hellenistic period in the southern Levant. Similarly, we can see that across all of these phases, wild game are relatively low in abundance. Let's now break down the relative abundance of our main livestock a bit more. Here we can see the relative frequencies of our main livestock with the raw and ISP counts displayed. Here, as compared to the previous figure, I've separated out sheep-goat specimens that were able to be identified to the individual species level. That is, we were able to specifically say if it was a sheep or if it was a goat. We can see pretty consistently, and what was somewhat a rather surprising pattern, that across all of these phases, sheep greatly outnumber goat for those able to be identified to the species level. It is almost certain that there's some goat that's been lumped into the sheep-goat category, but Richard consistently identified specimens as sheep or goat using elements such as the long bones and the feet that are generally considered rather reliable for differentiating these two species, and this has been tested by scholars such as Melinda Ziegler. So to put this into context, I put together a table highlighting the frequency of goat versus sheep across phases at Kedesh. Across all phases, sheep outnumber goat. We do, however, see less sheep being provisioned to the PHAB over time, while the amount of goats being provisioned really kind of remains rather stable. In the post-imperial PHAB, the relative abundance of sheep increases slightly, but it's not that much of a marked departure from the preceding Seleucid frequency. Overall, the frequency of goats versus sheep highlights that sheep were the predominant caprine provision to Kedesh and suggests that herds in the Hula and other surrounding environments were largely dominated by sheep. So this is a really scary figure. I'm going to explain it, I promise. To further try and puzzle through this seeming preference towards sheep, I decided to reconstruct survivorship in order to understand what age sheep goats were when they were brought to the PHAB to be consumed. So on our x-axis, we have these various age classes, and then our y-axis, you can really just view this as a percentage, so 100% to 0%. And what these points are showing is the proportion of the theoretical herd that is surviving to each of these age classes. So for instance, if we go to the older than 48 months or older than 48 years, or 4 years, excuse me, and go to the last data point for the Seleucid curve, this curve is saying that approximately 50% of the theoretical herd of sheep goats is living past 4 years of age in the Seleucid phase. Age profiles here are reconstructed from rates of epithelial fusion, and sheep, and goat remains are lumped together as there just isn't enough data to reconstruct robust curves on the individual species level. Here, I've also included models that reflect different secondary product and exploitation strategies. In light blue, we have wool. In green, we have meat. In dark blue, we have milk. And in brown, we have herd security. The survivorship curves from Kedesh are broken down by phase, so Persian in red, Ptolemaic in orange, Seleucid in purple, and squatter in yellow. Pretty immediately, we can see that none of these idealized models really exactly line up with the age profiles that we have from Kedesh. These sheep goats are seemingly rather old when they're brought to the site. However, it is important to note that these curves don't represent subsistence and herd management at Kedesh itself. Rather, these curves are indicative of the choices that those bringing these animals to the site are making. In light of that, and the older overall age of sheep goats, this is most likely indicative of wool and textile production in the Hula, with tenant farmers then bringing older individuals to the FAB as meat, rather than jeopardizing their herds and the stability of wool production. So in trying to think through this question of the old age of the caprines, the sheep goats, the preference towards sheep, and how this might be linked to potential secondary product production, I really thought it behooves me to look at other material finds from Kedesh itself, but I'll also kind of briefly reference some data from the Hula Valley. So in the FAB itself, remember, 30,000 square foot building, including material from the Persian, Ptolemaic, Seleucid, squatter, Roman, and Byzantine phases, there are only 151 textile objects for those centuries of occupation in a 30,000 square foot building. In comparison, if we look out to the Hula Valley and look just at the 50-year late Hellenistic occupation from the villa at Tel Anafa, there are over 342 textile objects. So it's very clear that the sorts of economic activities associated with wool and textile production are largely not occurring in the FAB itself, but do seem to be happening in these communities in the surrounding region. All right, we're going to stop talking about wool for a minute and think about another secondary product, that being meat. So I wanted to understand what portions of these animals were recovered and if we had evidence of meat cuts or whole animals being brought to the site. Here we can see the percent NISP and the various parts of the body that these caprine remains come from. The Kedesh material is dominated by feet and head portions, which when we think about administrators or elites in residence is really weird. In contrast, the limb elements are relatively minimal. When working through Richard's notes, I noticed that the limb elements were almost entirely composed of the diagnostic and more easily identifiable ends of these long bones. What seems to have happened, at least by my best estimate, is that either the shafts of these long bones were too fragmentary to be identified, or they simply weren't identified. This leaves the question then of where are all our limb elements? Well, they're certainly here. They were collected, they were identified. They've just likely been lumped into this medium mammal category, having been identified as things like medium mammal long bone fragments. And so this pattern in terms of body part distribution doesn't necessarily seem to be archaeological per se in the sense of this conversation about specific cuts of meat, but instead seems to be the product of taphonomy and potentially analyst bias. Despite this, we see evidence of whole sheep goats in the Kedesh material, indicating that animals were likely brought to the site alive and butchered on the mound, rather than having evidence of specific cuts of meat being brought into the building. So what are kind of our broader interpretations from the sheep goats? I'm noticing that now. Oops. Okay. So we see a potential focus on wool production due to their age and the dominance of sheep. But again, none of these idealized models are really an exact fit. These age profiles, again, are reflective of what animals are being brought to Kedesh by neighboring communities in their decision-making. We see apparent evidence of animals being butchered on the mound, and then it doesn't seem like administrators were able to, or that they simply did not want to, demand young animals to be butchered. So we've talked about our sheep goat. What about our cattle? In contrast to the sheep goats, I had less data for trying to establish the age of the cattle, so these curves may be somewhat inaccurate or biased due to sample size issues. Overall, similar to the caprines, it seems that the cattle were relatively mature when brought to the site. Their old age and maturity might indicate that cattle were used in surrounding environments for agricultural tasks as working animals, and then once older and past their prime, could be brought to places like Kedesh to be butchered and offered to those in residence. However, again, this is a tentative hypothesis, and I think I would need more corroborating data to definitively say that. All right, so what are kind of our overarching general conclusions about the mammal taxa? Wild mammals are a rare occurrence in the assemblage across all occupational phases. Domestic taxa are dominated by sheep, cow, and some goat and pig. There are more sheep than goats, and sheep, goats, and cattle overall seem to be relatively mature when they arrive and are butchered at Kedesh. And then it does appear that butchery is happening on site as we have whole animals present in the assemblage. So we talked about our mammals. What about our non-mammals? We're going to start with fish. So across all phases at Kedesh, catfish are our most abundant identified taxa. And then unfortunately, our second most common occurrence are unidentified fish. Not a great feeling. The remainder of the fish remains identified at Kedesh are often in singular counts. But the important thing to take away here is all the fish identified at Kedesh are freshwater fish. They are all coming from local sources. Despite this movement of goods from the coast to the interior in periods like the Persian, we don't have any evidence of things like salted fish being brought to Kedesh and people consuming that in any way. So they're getting all of their fish from the local environment, in this case, likely primarily the hula. The shell remains paint a similar picture of local acquisition. In contrast to the other remains, the shell assemblage here is reported via weight in grams rather than in absolute counts due to issues of data recording and quantification. Residents at Kedesh seem to have largely consumed various types of land snails, so similar to kind of, if you want to make a modern analogy, our modern escargot, and as well as freshwater river mussels. The one outlier that we see is a small amount of marine shell in the Seleucid assemblage. However, these are represented by two tiny little volute shells. So think of like the little cone shells you can get on the beach. So these are likely more representative of something like jewelry or charms or a trinket rather than being some sort of imported foodstuff. Another outlier that we see is in the squatter material. In contrast to the imperial phases, the garrisons of soldiers were most likely harvesting these mollusks themselves, rather than relying on laborers as in previous phases. It appears that these soldiers had a taste for freshwater mussels, harvesting them or carrying them back up to camp on the mound to serve potentially in something like a stew, or if we're thinking in the sense of something like New England, maybe as like a clam bake. All right. Together, the fish and shell remains highlight a system of local acquisition. Laborers and later soldiers went down into the valley where they fished and harvested these foodstuffs. While it's clear that fish and mollusks were part of the diet, their low counts relative to the mammal assemblage emphasizes that they were not an everyday foodstuff and instead can be viewed as a more infrequent and rarer treat for site residents. What about our birds? Well, unfortunately, the majority of the bird remains at Kedesh were not identified to the genus or species level. In Redding's notes, many of the bird remains were marked as to be identified, so it is certainly possible that the records of these eventual identifications may exist. We've yet to find them. Wild birds recovered at Kedesh occur in extremely low frequencies and are represented by species with local or seasonal ranges and include things like waterfowl that could have been hunted down in the valley. The most common identified taxa from the bird assemblage that we have at Kedesh are the remains of domesticated chicken. When breaking down the identified bird remains and focusing on the chicken specifically, two clear groups appear to emerge between phases in terms of the frequency of chicken. The Persian and Ptolemaic phases have similar counts, while the Seleucid and squatter also have similar frequencies. In all likelihood, the counts for chicken in the Seleucid phase should be even higher, as many of these unidentified / to be identified bird in the Seleucid material are likely the remains of chicken. And I say this because if we look at our other phases where we don't have as much unidentified material, the counts for the wild birds are still really, really low. So if we go back to this slide right, we have almost 200 unidentified bird remains in the Seleucid era. In all likelihood, I think the vast majority, or at least a very significant majority of those are chicken. So you can imagine that that peak of chicken in the Seleucid period should be even higher. So how does this fit into kind of a regional conversation? In their 2015 paper, Perigall and colleagues noticed an interesting pattern in the frequency of chicken in domesticated animal assemblages in the southern Levant. They found that the Hellenistic period seems to have been a kind of breakout moment for the incorporation of chicken into the diet and animal management systems in the region. They regard this pattern as a general Hellenistic one, and it is not broken down by phase. So before I compare this to the Kedesh data, let's just like put a little note in our brains. So the Persian frequency on average, right, in domesticated livestock assemblages, we see about maybe 3%. And in the Hellenistic, we see about an average of maybe 8%. All right. When we compare the Kedesh data to the average frequency of chicken in livestock assemblages, an interesting contrast emerges between the Ptolemaic and Seleucid phases. The frequency of chicken increases in the Seleucid phase and holds into the following squatter phase. While this is only one data set, the assemblage at Kedesh may suggest that the adoption of chicken was potentially a more established phenomenon by the 2nd century BCE under Seleucid rule, rather than being a general Hellenistic period phenomenon as a whole. Okay. So what are our major takeaways from the bird remains? Large amounts of the bird remains were not identified. Boo, this is really sad. Chicken represents the most identified species, and we really see, I would say, in the Seleucid era, even though a lot of it is unidentified at the moment, this apparent increase in the amount of bird remains and chicken as a whole. And then all the wild birds that we have come from local environments and have local ranges. Okay. I'm now going to take a pretty sharp pivot to a phase at Kedesh that I have yet to really discuss. And this is because the fauna from the abandonment phase largely do not represent consumption and provisioning, but rather seem to be tied into a targeted ritualistic event that occurred in the aftermath of the abandonment of the Seleucid FAB. And oh, here we go. Nope, I'm missing a slide. That's fine. All right. So several years post 143 BCE, people returned to the FAB. The northwest storeroom still had vessels lying in situ, and this room was later blocked off by a door block. The primary place that they seem to have focused on was the archive complex, specifically the deep archive room. We see the installation of a door block, as well as the burial of 2 infants. Now, we don't have any information about the peri or postmortem trauma in relation to these infants, so it is impossible to say whether these infants were sacrificed or if they were already dead and then buried here. To top this all off, those who returned to the archive then set it ablaze. Something that I really want to emphasize here is that the only space at Kedesh that we have any evidence of destruction is the deep archive, and it is in this moment. Nowhere else at the site do we have destruction. Okay. When examining the mammal assemblage, the abandonment phase immediately jumped out as an outlier. In other phases, wild game were a rare and infrequent occurrence, and were often represented by limb bones that could be tied into meat consumption. In contrast, approximately 40% of the mammal assemblage from the abandonment phase represents the remains of wild mammals, and these are inedible portions of antlers and tine fragments. By comparing the abandonment phase to these occupational phases, it becomes evident that wild mammals were a marked category of animal. It's important to note that all fauna recovered from this phase comes from the deep archive. Due to the history of the building and the tertiary and disturbed nature of much of the assemblage, it's necessary to try and disentangle fauna that were part of this dramatic moment versus those that are included in abandonment loci, but which likely represent fill from earlier phases. To do so, I separated out fauna between specimens that showed evidence for burning and thus which were more likely to be part of this event, or at least be surface level for this burning episode, versus those that were unburned. Bones with evidence of burning included 1 chicken bone and 5 sheep-goat bones. Due to these low counts, it's unlikely that these animals were involved as some sort of sacrificial offering. The remainder, and the vast majority of bones with evidence of burning, which was approximately 62 fragments, are the remains of antler fragments, specifically from red deer. So interpreting these antlers really kind of left me with a dilemma. That is, I had to figure out how to think about and interpret these remains. Antlers and horns have long fascinated the human imagination. Antler in particular stands out amongst mammals, wrong button, in that it is the only bone that regularly sheds and regrows on a cyclical basis. This unique quality has led to antlers in cultures across the globe to imbue them with meaning and symbolism. Interpreting these antlers in terms of their symbolic or ritual meaning is difficult. With next to no comparanda for the ritual destruction of a Seleucid archive, we are left in what appears to be a bit of an interpretational lurch. The following interpretation of the symbology of the antlers is then reliant on the context of the finds and the other remains found in the deep archive room. The antlers occur in association with the burial of 2 infants in the room. The infant bones themselves were never analyzed and remained displaced. Despite a lack of information about peri- and postmortem trauma events that occurred to these individuals, their mere identification as infants already provides critical information. Infants representing the beginnings of life are buried and deposited in the same space as potent symbols of cyclical regeneration. At the same time, this is occurring in the space of an abandoned archive that would have held countless bureaucratic documents. Despite these remains having powerful associations with the beginnings of life or rebirth, they are part of the destruction and the quote-unquote end of life of this Seleucid archive. Now, one clue that could really kind of help us try to suss out some more of the meaning behind this very targeted and ritualistic act are the identities of the people who returned to the archive and decommissioned it. So here we kind of have our little list of suspects who could be doing this. Are these returning residents? Are these disgruntled local farmers? Are these Hasmoneans or Judeans moving into Galilee? There's no real way of knowing, though the deposition of the infants and the antlers seems to really make it unlikely that this would be the work of Judeans or Hasmoneans as part of any sort of targeted destruction of the building. Regardless of who performed the destruction, it's clear that it was targeted, meaningful, and marked. Oh, and there's my little cross out. Okay, so in kind of really wrapping things up here and stepping back from this particular moment, I now want to conclude this lecture by highlighting what we can actually say about provisioning an animal economy at and around Kedesh. So despite these dramatic changes in imperial administration and these chronicled episodes of warfare, animal economy around Kedesh and provisioning to the site really changed very minimally. So some of these very small changes that we can see are things like potentially them consuming less wild fauna in the Ptolemaic phase, and the Seleucid phase potentially showing a greater desire for residents showing a greater desire for meat and getting that meat from more diverse meat sources. And then speaking about these conclusions broadly, what do we see? So across the imperial and squatter phases, the relative abundance of livestock here really remains constant with just some slight differences between phases. The abundance of sheep-goat, the preference towards sheep, and their relatively older age when brought to the FAB lent evidence towards a wool and textile economy in the Hula. And then wild animals that we do have being consumed and hunted and harvested are all coming from local sources, and they did not in any phase compose a large portion of the diet, especially in comparison to the domesticated livestock. So now, before I wrap things up, I want to briefly discuss Kedesh in a diachronic lens now that we've gone through the general results of the fauna. To do so, I want to jump back in time all the way back to the Middle Bronze Age and look at data from the neighboring site of Hatzor. In a 2014 analysis of the fauna by Marom and other scholars, they looked specifically at fauna from Area 6 on the Acropolis next to the Southern Temple. From this data set, they found that sheep at the Acropolis and potentially at Hatzor as a whole vastly outnumber goat remains. And as a reminder, this is something that we also see in Kedesh at all phases. What we seem to see in animal assemblages from the Hula Valley is that there are these 2 moments of flocks being dominated by sheep and thus 2 moments of seemingly intensified textile production. And so here I also include a very lovely table from another paper by Marom from 2020, which chronicles the ratio of sheep versus goat in the Hula Valley over time. When we compare the ratios at Kedesh to those we see from MBA sites and Hellenistic Anafa, the ratios of sheep versus goat really do align with this idea of 2 marked moments of intensified wool and textile production and 2 moments where flocks in the Hula were dominated by sheep. Now, I still need to think through why exactly the Middle Bronze Age and the Persian and Hellenistic periods seem to be unique in having this phenomenon in the Hula, but this does seem to be an initial pattern and one that might be suggestive about what conditions in the region limited or encouraged major woolen textile production. All right, I want to conclude this talk by discussing how we can really think about animal economy and management in this region during the Persian and Hellenistic periods. The stability in the general relative abundance of these different animals seems to suggest that animal management was really very stable during these periods, and in some ways seems to have functioned as a sort of base state or frame onto which imperial administration molded onto. A potential analogy or way of thinking about this is that of a clay figure with a wire frame. In this analogy, animal management and economy is acting as a base state structured by the limitations of the environment. These shifting imperial administrations then molded onto this framework. While aspects of material culture certainly changed over the course of these different imperial administrations, the frame onto which they were built remained constant. In the Persian and Hellenistic periods, life on the ground for farmers and herders remained the same. They provisioned those at the top of the mound in ways that were nearly identical for generations. While the empires that loomed overhead ebbed and flowed, the rhythms of life in the Hula and Upper Galilee remained. Thank you.